In July of 2018, one Devon stream kept flowing. Every river in the valley had dropped below normal in the heat. The meadows on either side had turned yellow and the soil was cracking. Southern England was in its worst dry spell since 1976. Farmers along the lower Otter were watching their pastures harden and pale. A researcher named Alan Puttock drove out to his monitoring site in early August. He had been measuring this river's water levels since 2015. He walked to the flow gauge at the enclosure outlet and checked the reading. The reading was higher than any he had recorded at this point in summer. He checked his equipment twice because the numbers made no sense for the conditions. The equipment was working and the water was genuinely there, flowing without pause. Upstream of the gauge, small dams crossed the stream at even intervals. Behind each dam, water had pooled and spread sideways into the flat ground. The soil between the pools was dark and wet, several hand-widths below the surface. A family of Eurasian beavers had built every one of those structures unaided. Puttock's team had been logging water volume in the enclosure since May. Their measurements showed the ponds holding close to 1 million liters by August. That water had fallen as rain on the surrounding hills in April and May. In a normal year, that water would have reached the sea before June. The beavers held it there while the ground outside the fence dried out. The numbers raised a question that was not really about the beavers, it was about what the land did with that same water in dry summers before. In those 3 prior summers, the same rain had fallen on the same hills. Without the ponds, that water reached the sea through the channel within days. The beavers changed how long the land held the rainfall, not the rainfall itself. Outside the wire fence, the stream ran low, warm, and nearly bare. Inside the enclosure, the soil stayed moist at depth, and the plants were green. The contrast showed in aerial photographs taken at the height of the drought. The fence showed in those images as a color line between brown and green. England had not had a native beaver in about 400 years. The bark along the water's edge was stripped in wide bands at knee height. Forearm-thick sticks had been cut at angles and moved to each dam. The newest of the 13 dams had gone up that spring. Older structures had reached 30 centimeters of height and were packed solid with silt. That compressed silt was what made the water storage possible. The Eurasian beaver was once among the most common large mammals in Britain. Bone deposits placed them in English river valleys at least 7,000 years back. Their teeth marks appear in waterlogged timber across the Thames Basin. Medieval Scottish records list beaver pelts among taxable goods at the border markets. 12th century documents name the River Tay and its tributaries as active beaver habitat. By the 1200s, 3 markets depended on the animal being caught regularly. The dense underfur was felted into hat brims that lasted years of hard use. The scent glands near the tail produced castoreum, sold by apothecaries as a remedy. Medieval church tradition classed the beaver as a fish for its aquatic habits. That ruling made it a permitted protein source on Fridays and throughout Lent. Fur traders, apothecaries, and fish day demand kept hunters on the rivers year-round. English accounts stopped mentioning live beavers before the end of the 1500s. Scottish landowners were still noting beaver sign in the Highlands into the 1600s. By 1600, all contemporary accounts suggest the species was gone from Scotland too. 4 centuries passed before any government formally proposed bringing them back. 17th century accounts of British wildlife began treating the beaver as a former resident. Welsh and Scottish natural histories described beaver habitat in the past tense. By the 18th century, Thomas Pennant's survey of British animals listed beavers as history. Pennant documented them as former Welsh river residents, with no living account to cite. His sources included naturalists from across Britain, and none reported a beaver still alive. The rivers did not register the loss immediately. Change at that scale moves across generations, too slowly for any observer to follow. The waterways the beavers had shaped for millennia were left to reform without them. Within a century of the extinction, the old rivers were beyond living memory. Wetlands the beavers had helped maintain began to dry at their edges and shrink. 17th and 18th century enclosure converted floodplain wetlands into productive fields. Streams were straightened and deepened to carry rainfall to the coast faster. By 1800, engineers treated drainage speed as the primary measure of river management. The goal was to move water off the fields as fast as possible. Every improvement in drainage made each catchment faster at sending rain to the sea. An efficient summer drain holds less water in the soil and vegetation beside it. Floods became sharper because water had no margin to spread across the floodplain. Droughts became harder because rain ran off before the ground could absorb it. Nobody in the 17th or 18th century linked those problems to the missing animal. The cause was gone too long, and the deterioration had become the accepted condition. One piece of context matters before following what happened in Devon that summer. A beaver dam does not stop a stream from flowing. Water passes through it, over it, and finds gaps at its low points. What the dam does is slow the current enough for the sediment to settle. That sediment builds into a flat floor of silt and clay behind the structure. The silt behind a beaver dam acts as a sponge, slow to charge and drain. In a wet year, it absorbs surplus runoff before the stream below can spike. In a dry year, it gives back stored water and extends the summer flow. A stream with beaver ponds upstream holds its level longer into a dry August. The ponds hold rainfall and spread its release across a longer period. Richard Brazier at Exeter measured how far the pond moisture moved sideways. His sensors tracked the lateral groundwater spread from the ponds through the enclosure soil. The readings showed groundwater extending beyond the visible pond edge by a clear margin. Meadow soil within that zone held higher moisture than soil outside it. The ponds were pushing moisture outward into the land on either side. That spread builds across seasons rather than appearing in a single year. A beaver pair in their first year makes modest changes to a channel. The dams are small and the silt behind them has not compressed yet. By the third season, each dam holds measurably more water than in year one. The ponds sit deeper, and the water table beneath them runs correspondingly higher. An established beaver site holds more water than the same site did in its first season. The Devon enclosure had 3 years of that compounding before the drought arrived. The effect compounds when more than one family works the same river catchment. Each family builds its own dam chain and its own zone of raised groundwater. Where those zones overlap, the combined water-holding influence covers a larger area. A valley with 10 families holds more water than one family's figures would suggest. Devon had one family, making every result a minimum estimate of what was possible. Puttock's flow data for the first 3 years showed a pattern he had not predicted. Water entering the enclosure rose after storms and fell during dry spells as usual. Water leaving the outlet varied far less across the same period. The beavers absorbed variability arriving from above and produced a steadier output below. That steadying is the opposite of what a straightened, unobstructed channel produces. After each storm, the inlet gauge rose sharply within hours of the rainfall. The outlet rose more slowly and reached a lower peak than the inlet. When rain stopped, the inlet dropped fast, but the outlet held its level longer. The beavers were compressing the spike and stretching the release across each storm event. Downstream, the river saw smaller peaks and longer tails of flow after every storm. The first beaver on the River Otter was spotted in 2008. A local resident found a dam on a tributary near the village of Otterton. The Environment Agency confirmed the dam, the footprints, and the chewed stumps. No official release had taken place in Devon, and the animal's origin was uncertain. The likeliest explanation was escape from a private collection somewhere in the area. The Environment Agency's initial plan was removal for disease testing. Any beaver of unknown origin needed veterinary clearance before remaining in a British river. Devon Wildlife Trust began monitoring and opposed the removal plan publicly. A petition gathered thousands of signatures from people who wanted the animals left alone. The public response was enough to pause the removal while an alternative was sought. By 2013, the otter had at least 3 confirmed breeding pairs. The animals had been reproducing without any supplementary care for 5 years. The government agreed in 2015 to run a managed scientific trial. Devon Wildlife Trust would coordinate, and the University of Exeter would run the research. 5 pairs were health screened, GPS tagged, and returned to the river as trial animals. The trial fenced a stretch to keep one family within a defined study zone. That fence let researchers measure all the water entering and leaving as a unit. Water came in from one upstream point and left through one monitored outlet. Everything that happened between those 2 points was attributable to the Beaver family. That design gave the Devon data a precision earlier observational studies had not achieved. Before the beavers arrived, the trial stream ran fast between bare grazed banks. Cattle had stripped the marginal plants to the root along the full channel length. The channel ran straight and steep, delivering runoff quickly to the lower valley. In winter, it spiked the downstream gauge sharply with each rainstorm and then subsided. In summer, it ran low and clear, with nothing upstream holding the flow back. The first pair moved in within a few weeks of the trial beginning. They found a stream with no dams, no ponds, and no shelter above it. Within 3 months, a dam of sticks and mud was crossing the channel. By the first winter, 3 dams had formed at intervals along the reach. Each one created a pool and began changing the ground around it within 1 season. Aquatic plants colonized the pool margins during the first full year. Dragonfly species appeared in summer 2016, not recorded in the baseline survey. A water vole moved into the wet margins in 2017. Brown trout held position in the cool pool behind the largest dam. The voles and trout had found the habitat on their own. No one placed them. Devon Wildlife Trust's invertebrate survey in 2018 found 47 species. The 2015 baseline survey on the same stretch found 22 species. That near doubling happened across 3 growing seasons without any direct biological introduction. Those invertebrates were the base of the food chain for everything that arrived afterward. A heron and a kingfisher appeared that year. Neither was in the baseline data. Otter numbers along the lower reach were also tracked through the 5-year trial period. The river is named for an animal in long decline across Devon. By 2017, otter activity along the reach was the highest in years. The beaver pools held trout at densities worth hunting for a foraging otter. More trout drew the predator that ate them, without any direct otter management involved. The team's 2017 report covered the first 2 years of measured data. Nitrogen and phosphorus at the outlet ran below inlet levels on every sampling date. The sediment data matched. The enclosure was retaining fine particles from the stream above. On every storm event, the outlet's flood peak was lower than the inlets. Across water chemistry, sediment, and flood attenuation, the results pointed the same direction. The interim data surprised the team on one measure in particular. They had expected some improvement in water quality and some reduction in flood peaks. The biodiversity response moved faster than any of their early projections had indicated. A 25 species gain in 3 seasons is not a gradual recovery. It is a system responding quickly to a structural change in its habitat. The invertebrate recovery also accelerated the return of the vertebrates that fed on them. Puttock wrote that the speed of the ecological response had not been anticipated. The trial design had not modeled how quickly the food chain might rebuild itself. The summer of 2018 arrived after a wet April and May. Both months brought above-average rainfall, and the soil entered June well charged. Then high pressure settled over England, and the rain stopped for weeks and months. Stream gauges across Devon were recording drops by mid-June that accelerated through July. The Otter fell to one of its lowest summer levels on record. Puttock drove out to the enclosure in the first week of August. He walked from inlet to outlet, counting dams and checking the level at each. 13 dams, 13 pools, every one of them holding water at a visible depth. Outside the fence, the stream ran far below its usual summer level. The difference between inside and outside the fence was legible without any instruments. He connected the sensor to the outlet gauge and let it log. The data showed the enclosure releasing water at a rate the stream outside could not match. He calculated the volume stored behind all 13 structures from the pond measurements. The surface water figure came to approximately 1 million liters that August. That number excluded the water in the saturated soil beneath each pond. The meadow below the outlet had been grazed by cattle for decades. The farming family told the Wildlife Trust the grass nearest the stream was still green. Fields further back had turned brown in June and not recovered since. They had not watered the green strip and could not explain the difference. Stream water from the enclosure was seeping into the bank and feeding the grass roots. Puttock's biodiversity records for that August showed kingfishers working the pools on multiple visits. Kingfishers need fish in sufficient numbers to make a stretch of water worth hunting. Their regular presence confirmed that trout had survived the dry months inside the enclosure. The pool stayed cool because 3-year-old willows along the bank were shading the water. Cool, shaded water holds the dissolved oxygen trout need to survive a hot summer. The reason the enclosure stayed wet while the valley dried sat below ground level. A soil with a high water table at drought start loses moisture more slowly. Partially filled soil pores allow moisture to rise toward plant roots by natural tension. That upward movement keeps surface plants alive when no rain has fallen for weeks. The beaver ponds had recharged that groundwater through 3 consecutive wet seasons. By that August, the stored reserve was the difference between green and brown. In a normal wet summer, the effect would have been present but invisible. Puttock wrote that the drought had not complicated the research but clarified it. The dry conditions were an instrument that made a hidden process visible. The longer a family stays, the more water the soil below them holds. Before their disappearance, beavers had worked British river valleys for several thousand years. Bone evidence places them in lowland river systems across Britain at their historic peak. A valley with beavers above it drains through pools and braided side channels. It holds water at multiple points rather than funneling it directly downstream. The surrounding floodplain stays wetter because the ponds keep the groundwater charged. When that system was removed, drainage improvements built on a simpler foundation than before. Each new ditch moved water faster than the land had moved it before. Former wetland peats dried as the water table around them fell progressively lower. Their loss reduced the water-holding capacity of each catchment that had just been drained. Derek Yalden's 1999 survey of British mammals catalogued what had been progressively removed. A parallel research thread had been running in North America for 2 decades. Glynis Hood at the University of Alberta had studied prairie beaver ponds since the 90s. Her Alberta data showed beaver catchments held more water in dry years than others. Her surveys compared water coverage in drought and wet years at both stream types. Her 2011 paper showed beaver sites held far more open water in drought. Hood's prairie data and the Devon data came from very different climates. Alberta's prairies receive less rainfall than Devon and face colder winters. The mechanisms Hood measured were the same ones Puttock's team found in southwest England. That consistency across different conditions suggested the effect was not site-specific. UK water managers had access to Hood's published work before the Devon trial ran. The Devon data gave them local figures to bring into government briefings. North American research had built the case. British field data made it locally actionable. Scotland was the first of Britain's 4 nations to formally attempt a reintroduction. A beaver trial at Knapdale Forest in Argyll began in May 2009. 3 pairs of Norwegian Eurasian beavers were disease-tested and released into the forest lochs. Norway had rebuilt its beaver population from near extinction over the previous century. The Knapdale animals were fitted with transmitters and monitored through their first winters. The loch margins at the release points showed changes in the first growing season. Sediment built up behind the new dams, and the water surface expanded around each loch. Aquatic plants colonized the shallow margins of the impoundments within 2 growing seasons. Waterfowl not previously recorded at the lochs appeared by the trial's 3rd year. The Scottish Wildlife Trust published those results in its annual monitoring updates. The findings showed that the Devon outcomes were not limited to English lowland rivers. A wetter, colder Scottish climate was producing the same structural responses. Kits were born by 2011, and the first Scottish-bred generation was alive. An independent review in 2014 recommended formal permanent reintroduction. The government confirmed formal reintroduction in November of 2019. A separate Tay population had been living without authorization since around 2001. Those animals had been breeding for close to 20 years before protection arrived. 2019's formal protection covered both Knapdale and the Tay animals equally. A 2022 survey estimated Scotland's beaver population at around 1,000 individuals. The River Tay and Perthshire tributaries held the majority of that count. The Tay demonstrated that a large river could support self-sustaining beavers across decades. A habitat survey identified dozens of additional Scottish catchments as suitable for more animals. England confirmed the river otter population as permanent in 2020. Devon Wildlife Trust's final report documented improvements in water quality, biodiversity, and flood attenuation. Natural England began issuing reintroduction licenses beyond Devon in 2021. By 2022, 12 licensed sites were active across England, up from 1. Sites covered chalk streams, clay catchments, upland pasture, and lowland fen. Each new site required habitat assessment and a monitoring agreement before animals were placed. Natural England set criteria to ensure only suitable river types received animals. Not every stream was appropriate, and unsuitable applications were screened out early. The scheme built a national database of outcomes as each site moved through its first seasons. By 2023, results were coming from sites well beyond Devon and Somerset. A chalk stream site in Hampshire confirmed its first otter territory within 18 months. An upland Yorkshire site logged reduced flood peaks within its first winter of monitoring. A Lincolnshire clay catchment showed water voles returning in its third season. Each site produced different numbers because each river type has a different starting condition, but the direction of change at every monitored site was consistent. Flood peaks fell downstream of every beaver enclosure across the network's first 3 years. The scheme was building a multi-site evidence base that single-trial research could never produce. Devon Wildlife Trust received more first-year applications after the trial than it could process. A waiting list formed for eligible landowners in Devon, Somerset, and Dorset. Many were farmers who had spent money on flood mitigation that fell consistently short. Earth bunds and storage ponds helped in some seasons and failed in others. Beavers needed no ongoing maintenance once established in a suitable enclosure. Washington state biologist Kent Woodruff had worked on a parallel water problem since the 90s. The Methow Valley's salmon runs needed cold water in the upper tributaries through August. Those streams were dropping to temperatures too warm for juvenile salmon by midsummer. Woodruff advocated for beaver translocation to the headwaters as part of the restoration plan. The first translocations moved problem beavers from urban sites to headwaters in the valley. Within 3 years, beaver sites showed higher late summer base flows than control sites nearby. Joe Wheaton at Utah State analyzed hundreds of stream sites across the American West. His 2019 paper showed beaver streams run higher and cooler in dry seasons. Wheaton argued beaver distribution should be mapped as a drought mitigation resource. The paper reached California water managers who had not thought in biological terms about drought. Wheaton argued beavers could be deployed with the same intent as water storage infrastructure. A reservoir can take a decade to permit and construct from a funding decision. A pair of beavers can begin altering a catchment within one growing season. His critics noted beavers cannot be directed to build where planners need them to. His response: beavers tend to choose the hydraulically correct spots in a catchment anyway. The gauge at the Devon enclosure outlet held steady through all of August. Puttock logged the final summer readings when the rain returned to Devon in September. He submitted the drought year data to the same journal as his earlier paper. The enclosure had held more water and released it more evenly than any unmodified reach. The drought had not produced a surprise. It had made a predictable outcome concrete. Puttock compiled the drought year figures alongside 5 years of baseline measurements. The comparison showed drought had not created the effect, but made it measurable. Every summer the beavers had been in place. The land had been holding more water. The dry conditions in 2018 made the scale of it unambiguous. These animals had been gone from Britain for 400 years. What they do when given a working stream had not changed in that time. The river otter beavers had no memory of Britain or awareness of what was lost. They built what their biology told them to, and the water responded. The Devon data recorded a small demonstration of a process that once ran nationally. 13 structures, 1 million liters, 1 family, 1 dry summer. 3 pairs in Argyll and 1 family in Devon shifted policy across 2 nations. Whether beavers alter a river's hydrology has been answered clearly by the data. The remaining question is which of the hundreds of suitable British catchments should be next. The answer will partly come from the expanding network of licensed monitoring sites. More catchment types in the data mean more conditions tested and more edge cases resolved. The best way to find out what a catchment can hold remains what it was in Devon in 2015. The land had been waiting for something to slow the water down.